Hello and welcome to another episode of Fair Talks on the ongoing conflict in Israel and Palestine at the moment. Fair Plan has decided to conduct an interview series in light of this conflict, focusing on long-term democratic and sustainable solutions for peace in the region, listening to kind of a variety of perspectives. Today, I'm speaking to Mohammed Zoabi, a queer Israeli activist and commentator who has been very active within the kind of social media community around this conflict, but also was working before on LGBTQ plus issues and Arab Israeli issues as well. So I'm very excited to hear your perspective and and chat. So I wanted to start with kind of more of a personal question of how are you doing? You're obviously in Tel Aviv at the moment, and reading your Newsweek article, I was kind of struck by way in which you described waking up on October 7th and it feeling like, oh, it's just a normal kind of uh, rocket attack, and obviously there was something different about it. I mean, that's like both striking in that the fact that the normality of it is very problematic, but also that this was a monumental attack and crisis. So yeah, how are you feeling?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for this opportunity, and for trying to actually create, constructive conversations around this issue. Because unfortunately, this issue is so dominated by emotions and by sensations, which is legitimate. But at some point, we need to be able to, set our emotions and our differences aside and try to think of a constructive solution or conversation that could lead us to a better future. Um, Back to your question, it's really a weird. It's every time I'm asked how am I doing, or how I've been feeling with everything that's happening, it's really hard to answer it genuinely, because it's very dynamic, and it really depends on the hour of the day. It depends on the day. It depends on on the things that are happening, because a lot of things happen, and the pace of things, the way things go from 0 to 100 is just, I feel like it's something that a lot of foreigners, a lot of people out there can't really comprehend that much, because the reality of conflict here is so intertwined into our daily reality that it's just, it's crazy how it's so normalized. And even in this place of conflict, a lot of us, let's say from the river to the sea, are more privileged than others. In Israel, it's it's much safer to be in Israel right now than, for example, to be in Gaza or in the West Bank. And it is something that, especially after October 7th, was emphasized for a lot of Israelis, regardless of our ideological approach, or our ethnic, religious, cultural, geographic background in the country, because it's not a cliche when people say that Hamas indiscriminately massacred Israeli civilians. They they hunted down Israeli civilians, in different locations on different occasions. Israeli civilians that are, let's say, that were easy to define, to identify as, let's say, Muslim or Arab or non-Jews, right? Because everything that happens in Israel and Palestine eventually affects Jewish people abroad, and it also obviously affects the Palestinian people abroad as well. Um, but unfortunately, too many times in our conversation, a lot of let's call them sub communities within Israel, um, um, and maybe, I mean, within Palestine, but within Israel. I mean, I'm speaking as an activist in Israel proper. A lot of the times in these escalations, our voices, our experiences, our input on the situation gets cancelled or pushed aside. Sometimes because we are, especially if we're talking about the Arab citizenry in Israel, that consists of about 20% of the population, we're very dual in our understanding of our reality. That being said, on October 7th, we got a glimpse to what could happen if the balance of power is overturned. When people talk about Israel, I'm not going to whitewash, Israeli policies or Israeli actions, or obviously not the current Israeli government. But unfortunately, when people discuss Israel, they always seem to be focused on the imbalance of power between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which is I guess it's a legitimate argument to put on the table. But at the same time, if we want to put that argument on the table, we definitely need to recognize, you know, what could have happened if, that balance of power or that imbalance of power was flipped, right? Um, Again, I'm not saying it to attempt to justify every Israeli action or every Israeli policy, or, for example, the carpet bombardment of Gaza. I mean, the Israeli government initially said that we will destroy Hamas. It's been 60 days. Are we close to that goal? Absolutely not. Are we going to destroy Hamas? Absolutely not. I mean, the current Israeli government, maybe not in the 100% makeup of it today, but definitely under the leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has been strengthening Hamas. It
Mm,
has been giving Hamas resources, or allowing Hamas to get resources, whether it is from the Qatari regime or the Iranian regime or elsewhere. And so the Israeli government bears a lot of responsibility to how we were basically able to get to, or how we got to the situation where Hamas was able to infiltrate, Israeli territory and murder over 1,200 people.
mm. And I want to, you talk about kind of the imbalance of power, um, but fundamentally within the kind of two-state solution, if Palestine is to be self-determined, how then, in your opinion, what assurances can Israel have that, like you identify the role of Iran quite strongly,
And
and
the Qatari regime.
yeah, and the Qatari regime, but what assurances can they have that um, that there will be they will be safe with that, despite the threat kind of on their border, um, and yeah, how do you kind of envision that, um, if and hopefully when there is kind of peace to the region and potentially a two-state solution?
Right. Well, it's a very big question that that people that are much smarter, older, more experienced than me were not able to answer for the last century. But what I would say is that in order to be able to even initiate a conversation between Israelis and Palestinians, we have to recognize two basic things about these people, about both sides. Um, when talking about peace or resolution, the Palestinians want justice. When talking about peace and resolution, the Israelis want security. And I think that Israel's curse is that it is positioned in a very, very problematic neighborhood, and it lacks any strategic depth, especially when it comes to the let's call it the green line, or the separating line between Israel proper and the Palestinian territories. Now, another thing that we need to understand about this region between the river and the sea is that there are two peoples. There are two peoples, millions of people who are part of two collectives, or mainly two main collectives, who have very strong national, historic, religious, cultural, and emotional connection and aspiration to this land. Thing is, one people was able to fulfill, their goal of sovereignty, and that is the Jewish slash the Israeli people. The other side has not been able to. Now, the reasons for that are there are a lot of many reasons for that reason. In my opinion, the initial reason that got us to the place where we're at right now is Palestinian political rejectionism. Palestinian political leadership has always been, they have never missed a chance to miss a chance. Every time the Palestinian political leadership was presented with an opportunity to uphold sovereignty, they rejected it. They simply rejected it because they, just like any other people, have let's say two aspects of their national aspirations. There's this this maximalist aspect, and then there's this aspect of understanding the pragmatically understanding the reality, and understanding that in order to achieve sovereignty, we need to sort of we need to limit our maximalist approach. And honestly, you could see this with almost every modern nation state, especially, I mean, let's take Europe for example. Let's take Hungary, for example, or Poland. or Ukraine. These are nation states that have, had their boundaries changed, moved east and west multiple times in the last millennia or in the last couple hundred years. But if you look at the Polish nation state today, the Ukrainian nation state, the Hungarian nation state, you see that they've somehow collectively decided to put their maximalist demands or visions for their nation states aside and focus on a pragmatic approach that will ensure their sovereignty in a certain territory, which could be seen as an unjust, resolution for a lot of people, because a lot of people, like for example, Hungary lost, half of its historic territory. Same with Poland, maybe not half, but a lot of it. Like Ukraine's main cities now in the West used to be Polish cities. So what I'm trying to say, my point is that I personally recognize that for a Jew in Israel, Hebron, which is in the West Bank, is a historical city that means a lot to them. And I also understand that for a Palestinian who lives in Jenin or Nablus or East Jerusalem, Jaffa and Haifa are historical cities that mean a lot to them. That being said, in order for both sides to be able to coexist somehow while limiting the threat to each other's right to self-determination, we need to be able to compromise. The Israelis, again, not saying it to whitewash, Israeli policies or the occupation or the things that have been done in our names as citizens of this country. But that being said, the Israelis have proved multiple times on different historical occasions that they are willing to compromise. We've done that in 79 with the Egyptians when Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula, which is double the size of Israel. We did that in the Oslo negotiations when Israel started to hand over control of territories to the Palestinian Authority after the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. We saw that in 2005 when the Israeli parliament approved the plan to withdraw from Gaza. And we also saw that when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon.
But the only issue is
The
that with a lot
problem,
of
right?
historical examples is that they haven't been successful in
That's
compromise.
that's the problem. That's the problem because as opposed to all other territories that Israel left, the West Bank is, from where I'm sitting right now in central slash southern Tel Aviv, is about 15 kilometers away from here. That would be without traffic, half an hour away.
Mm.
Now imagine if there's a Palestinian state tomorrow on the hills, the high hills of the West Bank, that looks over Israel's mainland, which is where I'm sitting, which is the cultural, economic, political, and international hub of Israel, where over 60% of Israelis live. If a hostile entity is to be in control of the West Bank, like there is in Gaza, for example, or in Lebanon, I struggle to see how Israel's sustainable existence and peace and security can actually be maintained.
Mm.
So,
But then what would Israel require of Palestine in order to provide that compromise and that trust? Like fundamentally, I think that kind of what you're getting at is trust. Like that's what needs to happen. And so in your vision, what is the process to that trust building kind of commitment?
so I know that I'm speaking from an Israeli perspective, and I really don't want to sound patronizing, but I think that in order for Palestinian self-determination to be fulfilled, the Palestinians themselves need to decide that this is their priority. When the Jews came here, or when the Jewish national movement initiated itself in the late 19th century, it was around the same time that Palestinian nationalism started to initiate itself and started to grow and develop. The difference between these two national movements, who share the same, who share a similar aspiration to the same piece of land, is that one side was able to put their maximalist approach on the side and to sort of uh, implement or take the opportunity to have sovereignty, even if it was on part of the land. So, for example, in 1937, when there was a Peel Commission that divided the land and gave the Jews 20% of the land, they said yes. Same thing happened in 48, in 47, when the UN partitioned the land and gave the Jews 50% of the land and the Palestinians 50%, or the Arabs 50% of the land. The Jews said yes. The Palestinians, the political leadership of the Palestinians, said no. So I think that the first step towards Palestinian self-determination is to shift Palestinian internal and regional approach towards themselves and towards their neighbors. Israel's not going anywhere. And I think that until that is realized, at least among half of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza, then we could actually initiate something forward. The second thing that needs to be done is for the political leadership in Israel to undergo a serious change when it comes to the composition of our political leadership, but also our ability to not only just subconsciously recognize that we're occupying another people that shares our homeland, but to understand that there's no sustainable, safe future for us if our closest neighbors don't have that as well.
Mm. And do you think
Um,
after this, the kind of extremity of this conflict, from both sides, do you think that that almost will be a positive force in kind of reinforcing that understanding? Or will it actually just serve to polarize even further?
well, first of all, I think it's worth mentioning that on October 6th, not it was random. It wasn't on purpose. It was a coincidence. There was a big poll that was conducted in Gaza that was published, and it showed that over 70% of Gazans want Hamas out, and over 60%, if I'm not mistaken, want peace with Israel. Does that mean that Palestinians or Gazans are obsessed and in love with Israel? No. It just means that they understand that they don't want to lose what they have. They've lost enough. They've suffered enough, and therefore there's an understanding that for a long-term, sustainable, peaceful, and secure existence, we need to achieve peace or a resolution somehow. Same numbers are to be seen in on the Israeli side. There was a big poll that was conducted among the Israeli population after October 7th, and it showed that over 42% of Israelis want complete Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip after the war. Only 20% of Israelis want to occupy and settle Gaza. So the majority of both Israelis and Palestinians understand that we need to give each other space. We might be stuck in the same small piece of land, but we know that we have no other alternative other than sharing it together somehow.
Mm.
Now, historically speaking, if you look at Israel, every time there was a traumatic big event that happened to Israelis, there was a political shift in Israel. Sometimes it took a few months, sometimes it took a few years, but there was always a big shift. So, for example, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War with Egypt and Syria, when Israel was attacked by surprise by both Egypt and Syria and lost thousands of people, a few years later, Israel signed the peace treaty with its biggest enemy at the time, the Arab Republic of Egypt. Um, Same thing happened after the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in southern Lebanon, which was not conducted by the Israelis, but it was overlooked by the Israelis. The Israeli army saw what was happening, and they just turned a blind eye, and that triggered a massive protest in Israel against the Israeli occupation in Lebanon, and it took 10 years at least, but eventually Israel left southern Lebanon when Ehud Barak, the leader of the Labor Party at the time, was able to defeat Bibi after his first term in office, and he ousted him. And his campaign, his entire political campaign, was that we're going to leave Lebanon. And a few months after he was elected into office, we left Lebanon.
Mm. So,
So what I'm trying to say is that it's not necessarily going to solve everything instantly right now, but I'm not as pessimistic as I was on October 5th, because I believe in the Israeli people. I believe in the wise collective awareness of the Israeli public. We've seen that collective awareness in the last year when hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets to protest our Kahana's government, the terrorists that we have in government, who were put in sensitive positions because of the prime minister's attempted escape from his own trial. When they
collective
tried to
isn't necessarily present with what is happening in Gaza at the moment.
right, no, it's not, unfortunately, but it's not because the majority of Israelis are indifferent to human suffering of the people in Gaza, but it's because of two things. First thing is we're still coping with the trauma of October 7th, people need to understand that October 7th is the day that it is the October 7th is the day when the largest number of Jews, obviously a lot of non-Jews, at least 100 non-Jews were murdered as well, mostly Israelis. But October 7th is the day that the largest number of Jewish people were murdered since the 1940s, since the Holocaust. And I think that in order for people to understand the Israeli public approach to everything that's happening with Gaza now, needs to take that into consideration. Just as when we talk about Palestinian trauma, or why, for example, Arab countries don't want to open the border and let Palestinians in, is because of the 1948 Nakba trauma. Same thing needs to be recognized and acknowledged about the Jewish experience, which is that for Jewish people, the sense of persecution is still there. It's still here. We've seen it. And with social media and everything, not only that we've seen it, it was also clear to us that, and I'm going to be very, very cautious because I don't want to instigate, more hatred and more violence. But as one Arab Israeli father said, who worked in one of the kibbutzim on the Gaza border, he said that when they were first, he was with his two children. He said that when they were first caught by the Hamas Nukhba, which is like one of the senior combat units for Hamas, who were the first infiltrators into Israeli territory, they grabbed him, like they took him. They wanted, I don't know what they wanted to do with him, kidnap him or I don't know what exactly, but he said they took us with them. They kept us with them, but every time there was like a friction with Israeli forces, they basically they told us to sit aside and to not say anything, otherwise they'll kill us. We didn't do anything. We didn't say anything. That's the father saying, telling the story, and they didn't hurt us. Thing is, there were multiple waves of incursions into Israel on that day. The army was busy securing, settlers in the West Bank, obviously because of the government of settlers that we have right now. So the priorities were shifted, and so the army was almost non-existent. Security forces were not there to defend the citizens who were attacked and butchered. And the father said that the second wave, which was the wave of angry mobs who came to loot, he called them like this. He said, they were the actual Nazis. And that is a quote that I'm, taking from that father who was interviewed in one of the leading news outlets, the Arabic leading news outlets in Israel proper. He said the real Nazis were, the mobs that came after in the second mob. Now, again, I do not want to incite hatred. I do not want to instigate, more divisions and whatever. Maybe we should soften the words that I'm using right now to describe the situation. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, especially for Arab Israelis, who historically have always been more sympathetic to Palestinians because of our exposure to Palestinian suffering, especially in the last 2 decades with social media, for the first time, because of that same exposure, we felt more Israeli than ever.
Mm. Well, yeah, and I see that example as a reflection of the kind of trauma and
So
and
and you see it there was also a poll that was conducted among the Arab population in Israel that showed that over 80% of Arab citizens in Israel reject Hamas's attack on Israel. Hamas also attempted, like they did in the past, to
I,
instigate violence in Israel
I
itself.
wanted I wanted to ask
Yeah.
you about the role of Arab Israelis within this very, very
Right.
contemporary context. And
One last sentence regarding this issue, and I'll let you ask your question. But what I wanted to say is that if that's how Arab Israelis feel, just think how the average Jewish Israeli feels. Again, I'm not saying it to whitewash, to justify, to try to forget that there was an October 6th. October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. Not that I'm justifying what happened on October 7th, but October 7th, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict did not start on October 7th, and that is important to, recognize and acknowledge. But if Israeli Arabs are feeling the way they're feeling right now, just imagine how the average Israeli Jew is feeling.
well, I wanted to ask about prisoners who were released from Israeli prisons on the demand of Hamas, and I think there was a recent New York Times article about a very difficult position in which they've been put in because even they were released, a lot of them against their will because they wanted to stand trial actually. um,
Right.
and now the kind of being targeted within Israel because of connection to Hamas, even though that's something that was kind of placed upon them. And
Right.
I wanted to ask your thoughts on it, but also whether that is is also a wider issue within Israel at the moment. Kind of Arab-Israeli like scapegoating, and yeah, and then finally, what kind of role in terms of constructive path to peace that you think Arab Israelis can play because of this unique identity that they have?
Right. So I think that regarding the first part of your question, I think that um, if we're talking about the prison, the Arab Israelis who were, I don't know if they were released, by the way, because they did not, they rejected, they did not want to be released.
I
Okay, let's start from the beginning. Since the beginning of the war, Israel is in a state of war right now. There's an emergency situation. Because of the emergency situation and the fact that we have a crazy far right government in power, the different ministers, mostly settler ministers, are um, abusing their power to basically what I describe as an attempt to import the tactics of occupation and oppression into Israel proper. Because since day one of this government has targeted Arab Israelis. They've marked us as, a potential fifth element from within. Um, they've marked us as potential enemies from within. And it is also what I call deflection, because the settler enterprise in Israel, which is a dominant political force in the current government, is the actual definition of fifth element. They are actively undermining Israel's security. They're undermining Israel's diplomatic relations, Israel's reputation, and Israel's ability to be able to actually cope with the existential threat it deals with, while at the same time, securing continued international support or democratic support for it because of their actions. Since the beginning of the war, more than 100 Palestinians have been killed. A lot of them were killed by settler terrorists. A lot of them were killed by Israeli soldiers who are reservists, who are settlers, who are reservists, who abuse the fact that they have weapons and that they are on army uniform in order to literally infiltrate Palestinian homes, murder, and terrorize Palestinian civilians. At least 1,000 Palestinian civilians were expelled from their homes in rural areas in the Hebron area in the southern West Bank because of these actions and because of the inaction of the Israeli government, or the turning of a blind eye to everything that's happening. Now, in Israel internally, the government has been, since the beginning of the war, they have been warning of ethnic violence within Israel. Now, they've been using what happened in 2021 as a proof to that potential threat. Now, what happened in 2021 is very, very simple. The Iranian regime and Hamas, supported from the other side, ironically, by the Israeli far right, basically instigated ethnic violence within Israel proper, because Hamas wanted Arabs to basically fuel ethnic violence within Israel to destabilize Israel's home front. And the Israeli far right at the time wanted to destroy the chance for a government that was eventually created that ended ousting Benjamin Netanyahu from power for the first time in 12 years, which would have not happened if that government and that coalition did not include an Arab, and not just only any Arab, but an Arab Islamist party in its coalition, and thus secured a majority and ousted Benjamin Netanyahu for the first time in 12 years. They knew that that was going to happen, so they tried everything they could, the Israeli far right, to destroy it. And the way for them to destroy it was to instigate ethnic violence within Israel, to trigger that, feeling that collective anxiety of Jewish Israelis, and to basically tell them, to basically prove to them that, oh look, you're Arab Israelis, the Arabs that you live with, the Arabs that you have hope, that you'll build a shared society based on mutual respect and recognition with them. Look at what they're doing to you. Now, if we look at numbers, for example, we were talking about thousands of people, both from the Jewish side and the Arab side. The majority of the Jewish rioters were settlers from the West Bank who were literally imported on buses into mixed cities within Israel proper, like Ramle, Lod, Akko, even Haifa, and other places. And the Arab rioters, they were mostly people from very low socioeconomic background, people who were provoked easily by the incursions that were happening from the Israeli police side into Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the usage of Hamas of all these motifs, of all these religious motifs, like the Al-Aqsa under threat, Israel's going to demolish Al-Aqsa, all of these things. So all of these things together, combined, were partially successful because it was a few days of violence between thousands of people that statistically don't represent the majority of both Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. Now, the current government have been using that and what happened back then in order to make people here believe that this is going to happen again. Thing is, since the beginning of the war, not only has in the Arab population in Israel, October 7th was Israel's most vulnerable day ever.
Mm.
If Arab Israelis wanted to use that fact, I mean, there are 400,000 illegal weapons in the Arab community because of the neglect from the Israeli government and because of the fact that, Israeli authorities and Israeli governments have been neglecting that. 80% of these weapons come from army bases. They were stolen by, criminals from army bases, and they were legally sold to, crime gangs across the Arab community in Israel. If Arab citizens in Israel wanted to hurt Israel, or if they had a collective plan to turn
Mm.
their backs on their country, they would have done it
Mm.
instantly on October 7th. But they
What,
didn't. And because they didn't, the current government has been actively trying to instigate violence forcibly by arresting hundreds of Arabs. It could be because you posted an emoji of a Palestinian flag, or because you posted literally a dark story, or like a black picture, basically sort of like resembling solidarity with Gazans or whatever. And the 3 or 4 Arab Israeli women who the Israeli government, I don't know if Hamas asked for them to be released. It could be that they asked for Arab citizens to be released because Hamas also has that interest. They want to see Israel in ethnic flames, you know? So obviously the government jumped on it and they agreed, and they wanted to release, I think, 3 or 4 Arab Israeli prisoners who were not even tried. They were not even put on a
I,
trial.
I think it was 14. Uh,
Pardon? 14 it was?
14. Yeah, women.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and but
And the majority of them rejected, and even the political leadership within the Arab community across the spectrum, literally from the Palestinian Nationalist Party to the Israeli Jewish Arab Communist Party, they both said no. We're not going to do that. We don't approve. And the majority, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of the Israeli Arab arrested women refused to be included in a
no,
in a treaty with Hamas.
course. But it kind of highlights, I think, and a lot of the backlash that these women are getting now, like highlights the position of Arab Israelis in that
Well,
because of
but the goal of the government, I mean, you really need to be, sorry, you need to it's very easy to see, what's the goal of the government behind this. They want to paint Arab Israelis as Hamas supporters. It's as simple as that.
but in the context of peace, then the role of Arab Israelis in kind of representing that compromise in a sense, in that obviously they have like Israeli citizenship and are unified with Israel, but also have sympathies with. I mean, I'm not going to generalize. Nor am I going to put words in other people's mouths. I'm not an Arab Israeli, so, but sympathy with non-Jewish Israelis or kind of non-Jewish peoples within the area. And so, yeah, what do you think the role is, and what would you say to the Arab Israeli community in trying to reinforce peace, de-escalate, and hopefully kind of help this conflict come to an end?
Right. So I think, first of all, the first thing that we need to recognize about the Arab community, Arab citizens of Israel, is probably the most neutral term because, we're talking about a very hybrid community when it comes to our identities and to our experiences. But collectively speaking, since 1948, the collective experience of Arab Israelis have not only been separate from the collective experience of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, Gaza, and elsewhere, but it has also been separate from the collective experience of Jewish Israelis. So we're basically, this ethnic slash national slash cultural slash lingual group that literally sits, even sometimes geographically, we sit in between these two national groups, the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs, who have been unable to reconcile for the last century, or for the last 76 years of Israel's history. Now, our collective experience and our collective identity includes within it, different aspects of our identities. A lot of us feel more connected to the Palestinian aspect of our identity. Now, Palestinian identity is a national identity. It's a modern national identity that developed in the last 100 years, just as Israeli or Zionism is a modern national identity that developed in the last 100 years. And I think that a lot of the times we're sort of back and forth between these identities, depending on our reality both within Israel and in the Palestinian territory. So, for example, when the nation state bill was legislated in 2018, we suddenly saw an increase in the presence of Palestinian national identity within Arab citizens of Israel. Following October 7th, we suddenly saw a decrease in Palestinian. I mean, these are polls. I can send you the links. We saw a drastic decrease in Palestinian identity and a drastic increase in Israeli identity. So I think that we go back and forth between these two identities because both of them are national identities. I'm not ethnically Palestinian. People try to impose on us this Palestinian identity. Palestinianism is not an ethnic identity. It's not even a cultural identity. Like, what's the difference between Palestinians and Jordanians? Like, not that I'm trying to cancel or undermine, but this attempt to always impose on us forcibly an identity that a lot of us see as a foreign modern national identity is just so not fair, and it also minimizes our ability to use our political, social power within Israel to actually help the general Israeli public shift closer to us. Because this is something that the far right in Israel has understood since day one. And that's why they refused, for example, when Benjamin Netanyahu himself tried to create a government with the same Islamist party that helped oust him, his far right partners rejected that offer because they knew that if you would legitimize Israeli Arabs politically, you would also legitimize, their vision for peace, for Israeli-Palestinian peace. And Israeli Arab parties, I don't vote for Arab Israeli parties. I don't like them. One is Islamist and one is communist, and the other is an ultranationalist Palestinian. So we don't have many options in that thing. But I do give them a credit for being consistent with their approach to what should be the resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the main things about their vision is recognition of both sides, both sides' national identities and national right to self-determination, and also ending the occupation, securing Palestinian freedom, liberty, dignity, and all of these things. When Ram, the Islamist party, entered the last government, there was no way the last government would have, started a peace process with the Palestinians because of its composition. But just the simple fact that an Arab Israeli party, an Islamist party, was part of the government with Naftali Bennett, who was the prime minister in the first year of the government, who is a former settler leader, that in itself debunked, this entire myth of the far right in Israel, that Arab citizens in Israel cannot be trusted. They're not partners. We cannot build governments with them. We cannot allow them to be part of the decision making in Israel. And so that in itself was a drastic shift. And I think that it reflects also our collective understanding and our collective shift in our reality here. That we started to understand our unique position and our unique role in basically the first step that you need to do in order to minimize hatred between people is to break the barriers of fear and of not knowing the other side. And like, we literally had a government that was led by the first religious Israeli prime minister with a kippah on his head. Right-wing parties, center parties, and left-wing, progressive left-wing parties, and an Islamist party with a hijabi member, and and sheikhs and people from the religious Muslim community in Israel. They were all working together, and they successfully achieved their main goal, and that is the ousting of Benjamin Netanyahu. And they worked together. The government survived for a year and a half, which is very unique for Israel because we change our governments here like we change socks. And I think that in itself sent a clear message to both Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews that the majority of us want to work together, we want to live together, and we can do it because we've grown collectively as a society after 70 years of independence. We've grown enough to the point where we can actually look at each other and we can work together to heal our internal and external problems. And I think that is the epitome of, in my opinion, of the role of our generation, of my generation of Arab citizens in Israel, because we've grown and we've Israel's our home. Israel's a Jewish nation state. There's a lot of aspects about Israel that doesn't, include us, that doesn't represent us. But I mean, every country has religious and cultural and ethnic aspects that resemble one group over the other. There's a lot of discrimination against Arabs. There's a lot of racist laws. There's a lot of things to be fixed. But all of these things are internal Israeli affairs that will be fixed by us, the citizens of Israel, by our political power, by working together in government, by building, trust between each other. The other thing that that needs to be understood about my generation of Arab Israelis is that Israel's our home, and it's not like a cliche thing to say. It's not like, oh, like we're romanticizing our relationship with our country, like a lot of people try to do when they try to tokenize us for here or there, like for this direction or that direction. So we need to understand that for the young Arab generation in Israel, Israel's our home. We know no other home. The cringiest but the easiest example I like to give is, I remember one time I was flying to America and I landed at this airport that was displaying, all these flags of different countries, and you saw the flags of Middle Eastern country. They were put, next to each other, and so you see the Jordanian flag, the Palestinian flag, the Israeli flag, and whatever. And like, when I looked at like the Middle Eastern flags, like I instinctively looked for the Star of David, not because I'm Jewish, not because I'm like, oh, like, cheesy and whatever. I know it's like a bit cringy to say, but like because it's you know, it's what resembles home to me. Now that being said, historically speaking, collectively speaking, and culturally speaking, our experience is intertwined with the Palestinians. As long as there's an occupation, Jewish supremacy, oppression of of Arabs, discrimination against Arabs will continue to exist intensively in Israel. And we see it in the current government. I mean, the current government is the epitome of occupation, of Jewish supremacy, of racism. And, it's literally our sins
Mm.
in our face.
And
And
I think this
so, yeah.
is interesting about your activism is that you're in a position to kind of cut beyond this binary of being like either you are kind of pro-Israel and you're within that camp and or you're not. And you see it within the social media, the TikTok activism that has happened since, whether you're behind kind of Free Palestine hashtag or Stand with Israel hashtag, there's
Yeah.
such a binary that's been created. And this is what I think is great about your activism is the fact in which you are able to kind of validate aspects of both sides and like you are cutting across that very firm
I'm sorry. I just, my headphones
creative.
died. Just give me a second. Sorry. It's embarrassing because I'm sitting outside and I
So
don't want to.
we probably have to finish soon because your battery's going to run out.
No, my phone's battery is fine, but my headphones battery. Are we wrapping up or?
Well, I was just going to ask you about, well, just about this kind of like, I'll start again so that for like the
So
recording
nice.
so
Thank
people
you
can
so much. Hold on. Someone just gave me. Thank you so much. תודה רבה. Pardon? Oh my god, you're so nice. What's your name? תודה רבה. איך קוראים לך? נעים מאוד. תודה, ממש תודה. רגע, sorry. Wide connection. Yes. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay.
Um, no, what strikes me about your activism is, well, wait.
Sorry, you're cutting off. I can't hear you very clearly. Suddenly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Now better. Sorry. Okay.
Okay. No, what strikes me about your activism is the way in which you're able to cut across this very stark boundary, very binary that has been created kind of and definitely emphasized since October 7th, of either hashtag Free Palestine, hashtag Stand with Israel. And you make videos kind of validating aspects of both sides of the conflict, which lots of people would sometimes see as contradictory. But the way in which you navigate it is quite interesting. It's very nuanced. It's very specific. You kind of agree to some things, but that does not mean that you are agreeing to everything. And I think that that's something that's quite rare right now, with particularly with the social media activism aspect of it, which like I've seen your parodies and things of, or not parodies of particular kind of Western influences takes on the conflict and
And if you allow me, I'll just say one thing about the current, Free Palestine movement. My only problem with it right now is that demonstrations and the rage that we've seen, the so-called pro-Palestine rage, it didn't start on October 10th when Israel started bombing Gaza. It started on October 7th.
Mm.
It started because they saw what happened. Israel didn't even respond yet, and they went on the streets and they did what they did. So what I wanted to say is that it's okay to be pro-Palestinian. It's okay to choose sides. It's okay to be pro-Israel. It's okay to be pro-Israeli. It's okay to be pro-Palestine or pro-Palestinian. It's okay to not even like one side. That's fine. You don't have to like anyone forcibly. It's not okay to have a double standards when it comes to whose suffering is more worthy or whose suffering is less or more legitimate, because suffering, human suffering, civilian suffering in general, is never okay. It's never legitimate. And the attempt to romanticize the suffering of certain people, like for example you see with the attempted romanticization of the experiences of the hostages who are seen smiling and handshaking with Hamas, while ignoring the fact that they were literally drugged and they literally have family members who are still kept hostage, etc., etc.,
Mm.
etc. So,
And this
so,
kind
so,
of links to something wider of the role of social media that I wanted to ask you about with the
sure.
conflict. Like, it's obviously been quite problematic, particularly with the spreading of disinformation. And I guess around kind of the idea of truth, there are a lot of different truths being spoken, and people are getting very, very angry and kind of inciting a lot of violence as to whether which truth is kind of correct. And so, how are you kind of navigating it? Like some of your videos are quite heightened as well. Um, and and yeah, what do you think your kind of role on social media, but also within this like kind of ecosystem and sphere of like quite radicalized information and activism from not necessarily the most valid sources? Yeah, just your general kind of thoughts on that and your role within it.
Well, that's a wonderful question because it is really something frustrating that I've been dealing with because talking about Israel and Palestine right now is a trend, and a lot of people who have big influential platforms out there seem to simply not understand the power of their words and the power of their platforms. And a lot of people from both sides of the spectrum are very easily manipulated to, for example, blindly echo information that comes from um, the Israeli government or Hamas or the so-called Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is AKA an office of Hamas. Um, and I think that that is part of the problem because if I, as a person who lives here within the conflict, I have my own privileges, yeah, but I live in this region and I'm very close to everything that's happening. I'm until this day very reluctant when it comes to echoing information that I get either from the IDF or from Hamas or from the Israeli government. Then why shouldn't a woke queer activists out there who want to feel good about themselves and so they hashtag free Palestine with no actual background or knowledge on the issue, why shouldn't they be reluctant to echo misinformation and propaganda? Like if I'm trying so hard to be cautious with the information that I put out there, knowing how much lies and how much propaganda there is out there, why shouldn't we be demanding the same thing from all these self-righteous, woke, privileged activists who live on their own separate continents and think that just because they're going to post hashtag free Palestine, it's going to actually help anyone?
But yeah, what do you think the kind of the path to preventing this is? I mean, I guess it's ever been thus with social media on kind of any controversial topic in which there is a binary. Um, but how people can you can prevent, yeah, prevent people from kind of jumping the gun. And I mean, maybe it's something that we can't change, but just kind of cool. have a role in feeling it out.
Well, I think, listen, I think it's, I'm not saying that people out there cannot have an opinion or cannot have emotions, especially if you're connected to this land. If you're Palestinian, if you're Jewish, if you're Israeli, if you're Middle Eastern, and, you know, this thing matters to you. I'm not saying that we can't have emotions. All I'm saying is that, I mean, and this is something that I've been trying to do. I've been trying to unpack all these emotions with simple, plain facts. Simple, plain facts that don't always serve my bias. I have my own bias. We all have our own biases. Okay, and I think that it's okay to have our own biases, but we cannot make our biases into a fact just because it is what makes us less triggered and all of these like woke terms that are being used right now out there when people are dying. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that not to minimize Palestinian suffering, but Palestinians, Muslims, and minorities in general have been murdered, butchered throughout the last decades in the region, right? It's also a result, direct or indirect result, of colonialism and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the failed drawings of the borders and the, you know, and the contradicting promises that the colonialist powers, especially the Brits, gave to, you know, different groups, like for example the Jews and the Palestinians. I think that if you're silent when Yazidi women were raped, or when 500,000 Syrians were murdered, including at least 50,000 Palestinians in refugee camps in Syria, if you're silent when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Lebanon live under de facto apartheid because they're not allowed to live in certain places, they're not allowed to hold certain positions, they're not allowed to even acquire citizenship because they're Palestinian, if you're silent about the persecution of Muslims in China, if you're silent about all of these things, but you're outraged when someone dares to burn the Quran or to draw a cartoon of Muhammad, or when Israel defends itself, then you're a hypocrite. And that hypocrisy is part of the problem, you know? Or if you started to talk about what happened only on October 10th when Israel responded, then you're also a hypocrite. If you were silent on October 7th, if you're silent right now when Israeli women are fighting to get recognition that they were raped, literally Hamas terrorists and others, not only Hamas terrorists, they filmed themselves brutalizing women, Israeli women, men and children, raping them. And despite that, people still out there are gaslighting us. You know what? It reminds me of the gaslighting that I face as a minority here in Israel. You know, when I talk about racism against Arabs, and you know, Israeli Jews would tell me, you have 22 Arab countries. Oh, I wonder what they would have done to you as a queer person in an Arab country. It's the same kind of gaslighting, but just from the outside world. So if you're part of that kind of conversation, you are part of the problem.